On a morning in the summer of 1724, a small boat drifted in the waters off the coast of Honduras. The sun was already brutal by 9 o'clock, the kind of heat that turns the Caribbean into a shimmering hallucination of light and stillness. In the boat sat a man, alone. His clothes were salt-stiffened and torn. His face was burned raw from exposure, his lips cracked and bleeding. He had no water, he had no food, he had no oars. He was 34 years old, though he looked older. His hands resting uselessly on his thighs were the hands of a working sailor, calloused, scarred, competent. But there was something wrong with his face, not the sunburn, not the dehydration, something in the architecture of his expression, in the set of his jaw and the emptiness behind his eyes. Something that made the few fishermen who would later claim to have seen him that morning describe the same detail independently to different chroniclers. They said he was smiling. The man in the boat had, until approximately 36 hours earlier, commanded a ship and a crew. He had possessed cannon, muskets, cutlasses, and stores. He had held captives. He had, by the accounting of colonial admiralty records, captured more than 100 vessels in less than 3 years of active piracy. He had amassed wealth that he had subsequently lost, squandered, or abandoned. He had killed men. He had ordered men killed. He had done things to men that exceeded killing. Things that even other pirates, men not generally given to moral squeamishness, found difficult to describe without visible discomfort. And now he was alone in a boat with no provisions, drifting toward a coast where he would find either rescue or death, and he was smiling. His name was Edward Lowe, and what he had done to earn his place in that boat, what he had done to make his own crew, men who had sailed with him through capture and murder and torture, finally decide that they could no longer tolerate his company, would place him in a category of piracy that even the Golden Age, that blood-soaked carnival of maritime crime, found difficult to accommodate. This is not a story about a pirate who was clever. Bartholomew Roberts was clever. This is not a story about a pirate who was unlucky. Blackbeard, in the end, was unlucky. This is not a story about a pirate who was principled in his own way, who operated by a code, who saw himself as waging some kind of war against the system that had produced him. Many pirates told themselves that story. Some of them may even have believed it. This is a story about a sadist. The word requires precision. It has been diluted by overuse, applied loosely to anyone with a taste for cruelty, anyone who seems to enjoy the suffering of others. But Edward Lowe was something more specific. He was a man who sought out suffering, not as a means to an end, not as a tool of intimidation, not as a byproduct of the violence his profession required, but as the end itself. He was a man who, when given the choice between taking a prize quickly and taking it slowly, would choose slowly. Who, when given the choice between killing a captive and releasing him, would choose neither, would instead invent a third option that colonial governors would struggle to describe in official correspondence without resorting to euphemism. He was a man who cut off lips, who forced men to eat their own flesh, who burned captives alive and watched, who, according to multiple independent accounts, laughed while doing so. The Golden Age of Piracy produced many violent men. Violence was, in a sense, the job, but most pirates understood violence instrumentally. You threatened it to make merchants surrender. You deployed it to prevent resistance. You occasionally used it spectacularly to build a reputation that would make future prizes easier to take. The violence served the piracy. For Edward Lowe, the piracy served the violence. The sources that survive him are fragmentary, biased, and frequently contradictory. He left no journal, no memoir, no self-justifying account of his actions. He was not captured and tried, so we have no confession, no courtroom defense, no final speech from the gallows. What we have instead is a collection of victims' testimony, colonial correspondence, newspaper reports, and one deeply unreliable but widely circulated text, Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, which devoted a chapter to Lowe that has shaped nearly everything written about him since. Johnson, whoever Johnson was, and that remains genuinely uncertain, clearly found Lowe fascinating in a way that other pirates did not quite fascinate him. The chapter on Lowe is more detailed than most, more lurid, more focused on specific acts of cruelty. Whether Johnson had access to sources we have since lost, or whether he embellished freely, or whether he simply understood that Lowe's particular brand of horror would sell books, we cannot know for certain. What we can say is that the basic facts Johnson reports, the captures, the tortures, the escalating brutality, the eventual abandonment, are corroborated by enough independent colonial records to suggest that the chapter is, in its broad outlines, accurate. The details may be exaggerated. The specific dialogues Johnson invents are certainly fabrications. But the picture that emerges from cross-referencing Johnson with court records, with letters between colonial officials, with depositions from surviving victims, is consistent enough to trust. Edward Lowe was real. What he did was real. And it was worse than any single source describes, because no single source describes all of it. To understand how a man becomes what Lowe became, we must begin where he began, not in the Caribbean, not on the deck of a pirate ship, but in the city that would shape him and that he would spend his entire adult life trying to escape. London in the 1690s was a city of approximately 500,000 souls, the largest city in England by an overwhelming margin, the largest city in the English-speaking world, one of the largest cities on earth. It was also, for anyone born into its lower depths, one of the most brutal environments a human being could inhabit. The London that Edward Lowe was born into, sometime around 1690, though the exact date is lost, was not the London of coffeehouses and parliaments, of merchants growing rich on colonial trade, of the polite society that would produce the Augustan age. It was the London of the rookeries, the cramped and festering warrens of poverty that clustered in the shadow of the city's wealth. St. Giles, Whitechapel, the liberties and alleys where the law's reach was weak and the parish's charity was weaker. We know almost nothing certain about Lowe's childhood. Johnson claims he was born in Westminster, which would place him in one of the rougher districts on the edge of the city proper. Johnson claims he was a thief from an early age, that he ran with gangs of street children, that he was violent even then. How much of this is biography and how much is the standard pirate origin story, the street urchin who grows into the sea rover, is impossible to determine. What we can say with more confidence is what London was like for a boy born poor in the last decade of the 17th century, because that we have ample evidence for. The mortality rate for children in the poorer parishes ran as high as 70% before age 5. Those who survived infancy faced smallpox, typhus, tuberculosis, and the dozen other diseases that thrived in cramped, unsanitary quarters. Those who survived disease faced hunger, exploitation, and violence. The parish workhouses that were supposed to provide for orphans and destitute children were, in practice, places of systematic neglect where death rates sometimes exceeded those in the streets. The criminal gangs that recruited children for thieving, begging, and worse were, by comparison, almost benevolent. They at least had an interest in keeping their members alive. A boy born into this world learned certain lessons early. He learned that the social order that proclaimed itself just and God-ordained was, at the level of lived experience, a system designed to grind him into nothing. He learned that the men who held power, the constables, the magistrates, the merchants, the sea captains, would use that power casually, brutally, and without consequence. He learned that survival required a capacity for violence and a willingness to deploy it. He learned that sentiment was weakness and that the weak did not survive. None of this excuses what Lowe would become. Thousands of boys grew up in the same circumstances and did not become torturers. But it provides context. The sadism that Lowe would later display did not emerge from nowhere. It was, in some sense, a response to a world that had shown him from his earliest memories what cruelty looked like when it had power behind it. The question that the sources cannot answer, the question that perhaps cannot be answered, is why Lowe's response took the particular form it did. Why he did not merely become violent, as his circumstances might predict, but became something more. Why he developed a taste for suffering itself, a need for it, a hunger that no amount of ordinary brutality could satisfy. There are no childhood traumas recorded, no specific incident that might explain, no moment of transformation that the sources preserve. Lowe simply emerges from the murk of his early life already formed, already by the time he first appears in the historical record as an adult, recognizably the man he would remain. Johnson tells us that Low eventually went to sea, as most poor boys in a maritime nation eventually did if they survived to working age. The sea offered wages, food, and escape from the dead end of London poverty. It also offered violence, disease, and death, but those were familiar. And at least at sea there was the possibility of advancement, of prize money, of eventual return as something more than a beggar. Low worked, according to Johnson, as a rigger in a Boston shipyard sometime around 1714. This would have placed him in his mid-20s, old enough to have already acquired whatever traumas the sea inflicts on those who work it. Boston in 1714 was a thriving colonial port, the largest city in British North America, a hub of the Atlantic trade that connected New England to the Caribbean, to Africa, to London itself. It was also, increasingly, a city that resented the regulations London imposed on that trade, regulations that benefited English merchants at the expense of colonial ones, regulations that were enforced with varying degrees of brutality by the Royal Navy. The shipyard where Low worked was, like all shipyards of the era, a brutal place. The hours were long, the pay was poor. The foreman had nearly unlimited authority to discipline workers, and they used it freely. A man who talked back could be beaten. A man who shirked could be docked wages he needed to survive. A man who stole could be hanged. Low, by Johnson's account, did not adapt well to the hierarchies of legitimate labor. The specific incident that Johnson describes, a fight with a foreman over wages that ended with Low attacking the man with a cutlass, may or may not have happened as described. What matters is the pattern it establishes. Low could not or would not submit to authority. He could not or would not accept the daily humiliations that wage labor required. He possessed both the capacity for sudden violence and the willingness to deploy it even when the consequences were predictable and severe. After the shipyard, Johnson tells us, Low went to sea on a small trading sloop working the lumber trade between Boston and the Bay of Honduras. This was hard work in dangerous waters. The Bay of Honduras was poorly charted, prone to storms, and increasingly infested with pirates who preyed on the lumber ships. But it was work that took a man far from the constables and magistrates of Boston, and perhaps that was the appeal. It was on one of these voyages, in late 1721 or early 1722, that Low's career as a pirate began. The sources agree on the basic outline. Low quarreled with the captain of his vessel. The quarrel escalated. Low and a small group of sympathizers seized a boat, declared themselves pirates, and sailed off in search of prizes. Within weeks they had captured a small vessel. Within months they had joined forces with another pirate captain, George Lowther, whose ship and crew were larger and better armed. For approximately 1 year, Low sailed under Lowther's command. We know relatively little about this period. Lowther is a less documented figure than Low would become, and the partnership ended before Low had developed the reputation that would later make his name worth recording. What we can say is that Low learned the trade. He learned how to identify a prize, how to approach it, how to take it with minimal resistance. He learned the logistics of piracy, where to sell stolen goods, where to find provisions, where to careen a ship for maintenance. He learned the politics of a pirate crew, how authority worked on a vessel where the captain held his position by consent, where the men could vote him out and had real grievances that required real attention. And he learned, presumably, that he had a talent for violence. By early 1722, Low had split from Lowther and taken command of his own vessel. The circumstances of the split are unclear. Johnson suggests that Low was simply too ambitious to remain a subordinate, that he had accumulated enough followers to crew his own ship, that the separation was relatively amicable. This may be true. Or it may be that Lowther, even at this early stage, had begun to notice something about his lieutenant that made continued association uncomfortable. What we know is that from the spring of 1722 onward, Low operated as an independent captain, and from the spring of 1722 onward, the reports of his captures began to include details that set him apart from other pirates working the same waters. The first documented instance of Low's distinctive cruelty comes from the capture of a ship off the coast of Massachusetts in the summer of 1722. The captain of the captured vessel, according to depositions taken later, refused to surrender some piece of valuables. Accounts differ on whether it was money, navigation instruments, or something else. Lowe's response was to have the man tied to the mast and slowly cut, not killed, but cut, small wounds accumulating over hours. When the captain finally revealed the location of the valuables, Lowe had him released, treated his wounds, and sent him on his way. The pattern would repeat. Resistance was met not with death, but with torture. Cooperation was eventually rewarded with survival. The message was clear. Lowe was not interested in killing prisoners if he could avoid it. Killing ended the suffering, and the suffering was the point. Over the following months, the reports accumulated. A captain who had thrown his cargo overboard to prevent its capture was forced to eat his own ears. A passenger who had hidden gold in his clothing was burned with slow matches until he confessed. A crew that had attempted resistance was lined up on deck and given a choice: join Lowe's crew or be tortured in sequence while the others watched. The colonial newspapers began to take notice. Lowe's name appeared in reports from Boston, from Charleston, from Barbados. The descriptions were horrified, but also fascinated. Here was a pirate who exceeded the bounds of what even piracy was supposed to involve. Here was a story that sold papers. The fascination was not entirely prurient. It reflected a genuine puzzle. Why would a pirate, whose profession depended on terrifying merchants into quick surrender, risk the complications that extreme violence inevitably created? Torture survivors talked. They warned other ships. They gave authorities detailed descriptions. They testified in courts. A pirate who simply killed witnesses left no such trail. A pirate who released traumatized survivors was creating exactly the kind of evidence that could eventually hang him. Lowe, it seemed, did not care. Or rather, he calculated differently. He understood that his reputation, precisely because it was so extreme, served as its own form of intimidation. Merchants who had heard what happened to those who resisted, Lowe might surrender faster. The torture was not inefficient. It was advertising. But this explanation, while partially true, does not quite capture what the sources consistently describe. If Lowe's violence were purely instrumental, he would have been content with a few spectacular examples. Once the reputation was established, the threat alone would suffice. Instead, the violence escalated. Each capture seemed to produce new inventions, new refinements, new ways to extend suffering. Lowe was not building a reputation and then resting on it. He was feeding something. The summer of 1722 passed. Lowe took prizes. He tortured captives. His crew grew as men from captured vessels chose to join him rather than face the alternative. His fleet expanded to include a second, then a third vessel. He moved freely through waters that colonial authorities theoretically controlled, and those authorities found themselves unable to stop him. The Royal Navy in the Western Atlantic was stretched thin in 1722. The wars that had ended a decade earlier had left England's maritime forces depleted, and what ships remained were scattered across an ocean that no fleet could adequately patrol. Colonial governors wrote increasingly frustrated letters to London, demanding reinforcements that did not come. Merchants petitioned, insurance rates climbed, and still Lowe sailed. It was in the autumn of 1722 that Lowe took the prize that would cement his reputation, not for its value, which was modest, but for what he did to its captain. The ship was a fishing vessel out of Massachusetts, captained by a man whose name the sources record as Graves. Captain Graves made the mistake of throwing his cargo overboard as Lowe's ship approached, hoping to deny the pirates their prize. It was a reasonable calculation. Most pirates, denied the cargo, would simply move on to the next target. The delay of punishing Graves was not worth the time. Lowe did not calculate as most pirates calculated. What happened to Captain Graves became, in the months that followed, the story that defined Lowe in the colonial imagination. Johnson describes it in detail that may or may not be embellished, but that is corroborated in its broad outlines by multiple independent accounts. Graves was brought before Lowe. Lowe asked why he had destroyed the cargo. Graves refused to answer. Lowe ordered his men to cut off Graves's ears. Graves still refused to answer. Lowe ordered his men to cut off Graves' lips. Graves, bleeding, mute, destroyed, was then allowed to live, released, sent back to port, permitted to become a walking testament to what happened to men who defied Edward Lowe. The lips. It is the detail that recurs. Lowe seems to have had a particular fascination with mouths. Multiple accounts from different captures describe the same mutilation, the slicing away of lips, the forcing of victims to eat their own flesh. Psychoanalysis at 3 centuries distance is a fool's errand, but the pattern is hard to ignore. Something about the mouth, something about silencing and consuming and destruction of the capacity to speak. By late 1722, Lowe's fleet had grown to 3 vessels and perhaps 200 men. He was operating primarily in the waters between the Carolinas and the Caribbean, targeting the merchant ships that carried the wealth of the colonial trade. His captures numbered in the dozens. His reputation had spread to every port in the western Atlantic, and the colonial authorities had begun, finally, to mount a serious response. The governor of Massachusetts dispatched armed vessels specifically tasked with hunting Lowe. The governor of Jamaica coordinated with the Royal Navy's Caribbean Squadron. Rewards were offered for Lowe's capture, rewards large enough to tempt even men who feared him. The net was closing, or so the authorities believed. In fact, Lowe would elude capture for another 2 years. The ocean was too large, the information moved too slowly, the colonial administrations were too fragmented to coordinate an effective hunt. Lowe would be sighted off one coast, and by the time a ship could be dispatched, he would be 500 miles away, taking prizes in waters no one had expected him to reach. He was not particularly clever. He was simply operating in a system that was not yet capable of catching him. But the system was learning, and Lowe, perhaps sensing the shift, began to move. The winter of 1722-23 found him in the Caribbean proper, south of the waters he had previously hunted. He took prizes off Hispaniola, off Cuba, off the smaller islands whose governors had neither the ships nor the men to pursue him. He took a ship carrying the governor of Martinique himself, though he released the governor unharmed, a rare instance of restraint that may have reflected calculation about the consequences of harming a high-status French official, or may simply have reflected Lowe's unpredictable whims. He also, during this period, demonstrated another pattern that the sources consistently note. Lowe was capable of bizarre generosity alongside his cruelty. Captives who he chose to favor received gifts of food, wine, money. Crews who surrendered without resistance were sometimes treated with courtesy, their ships returned to them lightly plundered. There was no obvious logic to who received mercy and who received mutilation. Lowe seemed to decide based on mood, on whim, on factors that even his own men could not predict. This unpredictability was itself a form of terror. A pirate who was consistently brutal could be understood. A pirate who was brutal sometimes and generous other times for no discernible reason induced a deeper kind of fear. You could not predict what would save you. You could not game the system. You simply had to surrender and hope. The spring of 1723 brought a change in Lowe's circumstances. He acquired a consort captain, a man named Charles Harris, who commanded a vessel called the Ranger. Harris was by most accounts a more conventional pirate, brutal when necessary, pragmatic when possible, interested primarily in wealth rather than suffering. The partnership gave Lowe a second ship and expanded his operational range. It also perhaps provided a counterweight to Lowe's excesses, a voice of pragmatic calculation in councils that might otherwise have followed Lowe's darker impulses without question. Or perhaps it simply meant that more ships meant more victims. The capture records from the spring and summer of 1723 show Lowe's fleet taking prizes at an accelerating rate, a dozen ships in April, another dozen in May. By June, colonial reports were describing the waters off the American coast as effectively closed to unescorted commerce. Merchants who had to move cargo were sailing in convoys, hiring armed guards, or simply waiting for the authorities to do something. The authorities, finally, did something. In June 1723, the HMS Greyhound, a Royal Navy man-of-war carrying 20 guns and approximately 120 men, was dispatched from New York specifically to hunt Edward Lowe. The Greyhound was not a ship of the line. She was a sixth-rate, small by naval standards, but she was more than a match for any pirate vessel, and her captain, Peter Solgaard, was competent and determined. What followed was one of the only documented instances in which Lowe faced a genuine challenge. The Greyhound encountered Lowe's fleet off the coast of Long Island in late June. The pirates, mistaking the warship for a merchant, approached confidently. When Solgaard revealed his intentions, running up the naval ensign and opening fire, the pirates found themselves outgunned and outmatched. Lowe, in his flagship, fled. His consort captain, Harris in the Ranger, was not so fortunate. The battle lasted several hours. The Greyhound methodically overhauled the Ranger, her superior sailing and firepower gradually reducing the pirate vessel to a wreck. Harris and his surviving crew were captured. They were transported to Newport, Rhode Island, where they were tried, convicted, and hanged. 26 men dying on the gallows in a single day, one of the largest mass executions of pirates in colonial American history. Lowe himself escaped. He fled south, his fleet reduced, his reputation for invincibility shattered. The colonial newspapers reported his defeat with satisfaction. The authorities congratulated themselves on finally bringing the terror of the Western Atlantic to justice, or at least to the beginning of justice. But Lowe was not finished. Within weeks, he had captured new prizes. Within months, he had rebuilt his crew. The man who had fled the Greyhound was now operating in the Caribbean with a new ship and new men. His cruelty, by all accounts, intensified rather than chastened by his brush with capture. It was as if the defeat had broken something in him, or perhaps released something. The reports from the autumn of 1723 describe a man whose violence had escalated beyond even his own previous standards. A Spanish captain whose ship Lowe captured was reportedly cut to pieces slowly, over hours, while Lowe watched. A Portuguese vessel was taken, and its crew burned alive, not for any particular offense, not for resistance, simply because Lowe decided that they would burn. The crew that had followed him began, for the first time, to show signs of unease. This is the point in the story where the sources become most tangled, where Johnson's account and the colonial records diverge most sharply, where the question of what actually happened becomes genuinely difficult to answer. What is clear is that sometime in late 1723 or early 1724, Lowe's relationship with his crew began to deteriorate. What is clear is that the men who had tolerated his cruelty when it was directed at others began to fear it might be directed at them. What is clear is that Edward Lowe, the most feared pirate in the Western Atlantic, was losing his grip on the one thing that had made his power possible: the consent of the men who served him. The sea that had given him freedom was about to take it away. The violence that had made him a legend was about to make him an outcast. The crew that had feared him was about to do something that he, with all his capacity for cruelty, had never imagined. They were going to leave him behind. The question of how it happened, the precise mechanism by which Edward Lowe lost command of his own vessel, is one that the historical record answers only in fragments. Johnson's account, written within a few years of the events, provides the most detailed narrative, but Johnson was not there, and his sources were the usual mixture of sailors' testimony, newspaper reports, and rumor hardened into fact by repetition. The colonial records are terser and more reliable in their way, but they tell us only outcomes, not processes. A man was marooned, a crew sailed away. The Atlantic does not explain itself. What we can reconstruct is this. By the winter of 1723-1724, Lowe's fleet had been reduced to a single vessel, a sloop whose name the sources do not consistently record. The men aboard her numbered perhaps 40 or 50, the remnants of crews that had once filled multiple ships, survivors of battles and deserters from prizes, the kind of mixed company that characterized every pirate vessel, but that now, in Lowe's case, included men who had witnessed things that even hardened criminals found difficult to stomach. They had watched captains mutilated. They had participated in burnings. They had seen Lowe's rages turn increasingly toward his own people. The incident that precipitated the break, if we can trust Johnson's account, involved Lowe's quartermaster. The quartermaster on a pirate ship was not a subordinate in the naval sense. He was an elected officer, chosen by the crew to represent their interests, to distribute plunder fairly, to mediate disputes, and to serve as a check on the captain's authority. The relationship between captain and quartermaster was the constitutional balance of pirate governance. The captain commanded in battle and in chase, but the quartermaster commanded in all other matters, and neither could act against the crew's collective will without consequence. Low, by the winter of 1724, had begun to ignore this balance. The specific dispute is recorded only vaguely. Johnson says that Low, in one of his rages, struck his quartermaster. Other accounts suggest he killed the man outright. What matters is not the precise nature of the violence, but its target. To strike a quartermaster was to strike the crew itself. It was to declare that the rules that bound every other pirate captain did not bind Edward Low. It was to transform oneself from a leader into a tyrant, and pirates, whatever else they were, had fled tyranny. They had left the Navy and the merchant service precisely because they refused to be beaten, starved, and worked to death at the pleasure of men who considered them disposable. They had chosen piracy because it offered them a voice, a vote, a share. And now their captain was behaving exactly like the officers they had escaped. The crew's response was not mutiny in the dramatic sense. There was no battle, no seizure of the ship, no dramatic confrontation at sword point. What happened was quieter, and in its way, more devastating. The crew simply decided that Edward Low was no longer their captain. They held a vote. The vote went against him, and then they put him off the ship. The method was marooning, the traditional pirate punishment for crimes against the crew. A man sentenced to marooning was put ashore on a deserted island or sandbar with minimal supplies, a pistol, a flask of water, perhaps a day's worth of food. He was left to die slowly of thirst, starvation, or exposure, or to use the pistol on himself when the waiting became unbearable. It was considered a fate worse than hanging, which at least was quick. Marooning was designed to give a man time to contemplate his sins before the end. Low was not marooned alone. According to most accounts, he was put off with a handful of men who had remained loyal to him, 2 or 3 perhaps, the hardcore of his personal following, who either chose to share his fate or were forced to share it by the crew's judgment. They were set adrift in a small boat, without provisions to speak of, somewhere in the waters between the Caribbean and the South American coast. The ship, Low's ship, the vessel he had captained, the instrument of his power, sailed away and left them. What the crew felt as they watched the boat grow smaller on the horizon, we cannot know. Relief, certainly. Perhaps shame. Perhaps the particular unease of men who have done something necessary and irrevocable, who have exercised a power they did not know they possessed. They had followed this man. They had obeyed his orders. They had participated in his cruelties, some of them eagerly, others with varying degrees of reluctance. And now they were sailing away from him, leaving him to die in the way that pirates left their worst offenders to die. And the sun was setting on the water, and the boat was disappearing, and Edward Low was no longer their problem. The captain who replaced Low, his name is recorded in some sources as Francis Spriggs, though the identification is uncertain, turned the ship toward new hunting grounds and new crimes. The crew continued their trade. They captured ships and divided plunder and drank rum and died in various ways over the following months and years. Some were captured and hanged. Some died of disease or accident. Some, presumably, slipped away into obscurity, took up honest work in some colonial port, and lived out their lives as men whose pasts were nobody's business but their own. The sea takes these stories and does not return them. But the question remains, what happened to Low? The honest answer is that we do not know. The sources diverge at precisely this point, offering multiple endings to a story that the Atlantic itself has declined to conclude. Johnson's account, written in 1724, says that Low was rescued by a French vessel and taken to Martinique, where the French authorities, recognizing him, or perhaps simply recognizing the type, hanged him without trial. This would be a neat ending, a kind of justice, the savage finally meeting the fate he had inflicted on so many others. But there is no French record of such an execution, no colonial correspondence confirming it, no newspaper account from Martinique describing the hanging of the notorious English pirate. Johnson may have been reporting what he believed to be true. He may have been inventing a satisfying conclusion. He may have been passing along a rumor that had already hardened into legend by the time he set it down. Other accounts suggest different fates. Some said Lowe made it to shore, somewhere along the coast of Brazil, and lived out his days in obscurity. Some said he was captured by the Spanish and executed in Havana. Some said he reached a French island and simply disappeared into the population, one more nameless sailor in a world full of nameless sailors. Some said he died in the open boat, thirst and exposure claiming him before any rescue could arrive, his body left to the fish and the current and the indifferent processes of decomposition. The truth is that Edward Lowe vanishes from the historical record sometime in 1724 and never reappears. The man who had terrorized the Atlantic, who had captured over 100 vessels, who had tortured and killed in ways that shocked even his contemporaries, simply ceases to exist in the documentation. No trial records bear his name after that winter. No execution notices describe his death. No colonial officials report his capture. No ship's logs record his presence. He is there, and then he is not, and the gap where he should be has never been filled. This is not unusual in pirate history. The sea was vast, the record-keeping was incomplete, and men disappeared all the time without anyone noting where they had gone. But in Lowe's case, the absence feels different. It feels like the ocean itself refusing to give back what it had taken. It feels like the end of a story that does not want to end, that prefers to remain open, that would rather leave us wondering than give us the satisfaction of knowing. What we can say is this: whether Lowe died in a French prison, on a Brazilian beach, in an open boat on the Caribbean, or somewhere else entirely, his death would not have been peaceful. A man who had inflicted that much suffering does not simply close his eyes and drift away. The body remembers. The mind remembers. Whatever happened to Edward Lowe in his final hours, whether they lasted minutes or days, whether they came under a gallows or under the sun, he would have had time to think about the things he had done, the lips he had cut off, the men he had burned, the terror he had made his instrument and his pleasure. Perhaps he felt remorse. Perhaps he felt nothing at all. The sources do not tell us, and the silence of the sources is itself a kind of judgment. What remains is the question of why. Not why Lowe was cruel. We've already established that cruelty was his nature, his tool, his apparent pleasure. But why this man, in this moment, in this particular corner of the Atlantic world? What produced him? What made it possible for him to flourish, even briefly, before the world closed in around him? The answer lies partly in the world itself. The Atlantic of the early 1720s was a space of extraordinary violence, and Lowe was not an aberration within it, but an expression of it. Consider the systems that surrounded him, the slave trade, which moved millions of human beings across the ocean in conditions of unimaginable horror, which treated people as cargo and death as an acceptable loss rate, which built its profits on suffering so vast that the mind struggles to hold it. The plantation economies of the Caribbean and the American South, which worked human beings to death in the sugar fields and the tobacco fields and the rice fields, which measured life expectancy in years rather than decades, which created wealth for some by creating agony for others. The naval and merchant services, which pressed men into service against their will, which flogged them for minor infractions, which fed them rotting food and worked them until they dropped, which considered their lives expendable and their complaints irrelevant. This was the world that produced Edward Lowe. Not as an excuse. Nothing excuses what he did, but as a context. He was cruel in a world that had taught him cruelty. He was violent in a world that ran on violence. He was brutal in a world that had made brutality the foundation of its economy, its politics, its daily life. The difference between Lowe and the men who hunted him was not that he was capable of inflicting suffering, and they were not. The difference was that he inflicted suffering outside the channels that the state had authorized, that he directed his violence at the wrong targets, that he threatened the commerce that the empire required. The planters who worked their slaves to death were respectable men. The naval captains who flogged their crews into submission were servants of the crown. Edward Lowe, who did similar things to similar bodies, was a criminal because he did them without permission. This is not an argument for moral equivalence. Lowe's cruelty was personal, intimate, and excessive even by the standards of his time. He took pleasure in pain in ways that the plantation owner and the naval captain, whatever their crimes, did not. He was genuinely pathological, a man whose relationship to violence had become something other than instrumental. But to understand him fully, we must understand the world that shaped him, the world that gave him his first lessons in what human beings could do to each other, the world that showed him from his earliest years in the slums of Westminster that power expressed itself through the body, and that those without power existed at the mercy of those who had it. Lowe learned these lessons well. He learned them too well. And when he turned them back upon the world recoiled from its own reflection. There's another angle to the question of why, and this one is harder to articulate because it touches on something that the historical sources cannot capture: the subjective experience of being Edward Lowe. What did he feel when he cut off a man's lips? What did he feel when he watched a ship burn with its crew aboard? What was happening inside him in those moments when the violence that would define his legacy was being enacted? The honest answer is that we have no way of knowing. We cannot perform a psychological autopsy on a man who died 3 centuries ago. We cannot interview his victims or his crew members, cannot administer questionnaires or analyze brain scans, cannot do any of the things that modern psychology might do to understand a person who had done what Lowe did. All we have is the behavior itself, recorded at a distance by men who were not there, filtered through the lenses of their own assumptions and prejudices. But we can observe patterns. We can note that Lowe's violence was often performative, designed to be seen, to be talked about, to spread terror in advance of his arrival. We can note that it escalated over time, as if each act required a more extreme successor to produce the same effect. We can note that it was often triggered by perceived slights or resistance, as if Lowe experienced any challenge to his authority as an existential threat that required an overwhelming response. And we can note that it eventually turned inward, toward his own crew, as if the violence had become an end in itself rather than a means to anything else. These patterns suggest something, though we must be careful not to overinterpret. They suggest a man for whom violence was not simply a tool, but a language, the only language in which he felt fully fluent, the only register in which he could express whatever it was that churned inside him. They suggest a man whose identity had become inseparable from his capacity to hurt, who could not imagine himself without the power to inflict pain, who needed the screams and the blood and the terror the way other men needed food or drink or company. Whether this makes him a monster or a victim is a question the sources cannot answer, and perhaps a question that has no answer. He was both. He was neither. He was a man, shaped by a brutal world into a brutal shape. And then he did brutal things, and then he disappeared, and the world went on without him as it always does, indifferent to the lives it produces and consumes. The ships still sailed, the trade winds still blew, the Atlantic still stretched between continents, carrying sugar and slaves and rum and tobacco and all the other commodities that the empire required. Edward Lowe was a ripple on that surface, a disturbance that lasted a few years and then subsided, leaving behind only the stories that sailors told each other in the taverns of Boston and Newport and Kingston, stories that grew taller with each telling, that blurred and merged and contradicted each other until the man himself became indistinguishable from the legend. And the legend was useful. The legend served a purpose. Colonial authorities invoked it to justify their crackdowns on piracy. Preachers invoked it to warn their congregations about the wages of sin. Writers invoked it to sell books. Everyone had a use for Edward Lowe, and the uses they found for him told you more about them than about him. He became a screen onto which the anxieties of the age could be projected, a symbol of everything that respectable society feared and secretly envied, a cautionary tale and a fantasy and a nightmare all at once. But beneath the legend, beneath the uses to which his story was put, there was still the man. There was still the boy in Westminster, thin and hungry, learning what the world would teach him. There was still the young man on the ships, discovering that his fists could buy him respect. There was still the pirate captain, standing on a deck in the Caribbean sun, watching a man beg for mercy that would not come. There was still the outcast in the small boat, watching his ship sail away, knowing that everything he had built was now behind him, and that nothing lay ahead but the sea and the sun, and the slow approach of whatever end the ocean had chosen for him. The wind that filled the sails of the fleeing ship was the same wind that pushed his little boat. The current that carried them apart had no knowledge of what either vessel had done or would do. The sea, that great metaphor for indifference, continued its work of separating men from each other, of swallowing evidence, of smoothing over the disruptions that human violence makes on its surface. Edward Lowe was gone. The waters that had given him his power had taken him back, and they were not telling anyone what they had done with him. The silence that followed was not peace exactly, but it was something like an ending. The ports he had terrorized slowly returned to their ordinary rhythms. The merchants resumed their trade, watchful still, but no longer paralyzed. The governors wrote different reports about different threats to different officials in London. The news cycle, such as it was, moved on. And somewhere, in a French prison or a Brazilian village or beneath the waves themselves, a man who had made himself unforgettable was finally being forgotten. The forgetting was slow, as forgetting always is. It did not happen all at once, but in layers, like sediment settling over a wreck. First, the immediate fear faded. The captains who had sailed with loaded guns and constant watches began gradually to relax. Then, the stories themselves began to blur. Men who had survived encounters with Lowe died of fever or age or the ordinary violence of the sea, and their first-hand accounts died with them. Their sons remembered fragments, their grandsons remembered less, and within 2 generations the living memory of Edward Lowe had contracted to a handful of aging sailors in waterfront taverns, men whose credibility was questionable and whose details contradicted each other in ways that could not be reconciled. But the written record, that persisted longer. The trial transcripts, the newspaper accounts, the letters from colonial governors, the pamphlets that printers in Boston and London had rushed into production while the terror was still fresh. These survived in archives and private collections, waiting for someone to find them interesting again. And eventually, someone did. The 19th century, with its appetite for romantic outlaws and its comfortable distance from the realities of maritime violence, rediscovered the pirates of the Golden Age and transformed them into figures of popular entertainment. Blackbeard became a character in adventure novels. Anne Bonny and Mary Red became symbols of female transgression. Even the most vicious of the old sea rovers were softened, sanitized, made palatable for audiences who wanted thrills without consequences. Lowe, however, proved resistant to this treatment. His story contained too much that could not be romanticized. You could not make a hero of a man who cut off lips and forced men to eat their own flesh. You could not sentimentalize a captain who burned ships with their crews locked below decks. The details were too specific, too well documented, too disturbing. Where other pirates could be reimagined as rebels against an unjust system or free spirits who refused to submit to authority, Lowe remained what he had always been, a sadist. And sadism, unlike rebellion or freedom, has no natural constituency. No one wants to identify with it. No one wants to celebrate it. It can only be studied from a distance, with the clinical detachment of the historian or the prurient fascination of the true crime enthusiast. So, Lowe occupied a strange position in the popular imagination. He was famous enough to be mentioned in any comprehensive account of Golden Age piracy, but not famous enough to become a cultural icon. He appeared in lists and footnotes and brief paragraphs that summarized his worst atrocities before moving on to more marketable figures. He was invoked when writers needed an example of piracy at its most extreme, then quickly set aside. He served the narrative needs of others without ever becoming a narrative center in his own right. Even now, 3 centuries after his disappearance, he remains more useful as a contrast than as a subject, the dark background against which more palatable pirates can shine, the proof that not everyone who flew the black flag was a lovable rogue. But this is precisely what makes him worth understanding. The lovable rogues tell us what we want to believe about ourselves. The sadists tell us what we are afraid we might be. Lowe's story is uncomfortable because it refuses the consolations that other pirate narratives offer. There is no hidden nobility in him, no code of honor beneath the cruelty, no tragic flaw that might explain and thus contain his violence. He simply was what he was, a man who enjoyed hurting people and who found, in the anarchic conditions of the early 18th century Atlantic, the perfect environment in which to indulge that enjoyment. The Golden Age did not create Edward Lowe, but it gave him room to flourish. It provided the ships, the weapons, the isolation from law, and most importantly, the endless supply of victims, men whose screams would never reach any court, whose deaths would never be prosecuted, whose suffering could be inflicted without consequence. This is the part of the story that histories of piracy tend to hurry past. The economic analysis is comfortable. We can discuss the disruption to trade routes, the impact on insurance rates, the cost-benefit calculations of naval deployment. The political analysis is comfortable too. We can trace the relationships between piracy and imperial rivalry, the ways in which governors sometimes colluded with pirates and sometimes hunted them, the gradual assertion of state power over ungoverned spaces. Even the social analysis has its appeal. We can talk about the democratic practices aboard pirate ships, the relative equality of treatment regardless of background, the rough meritocracy that allowed men of ability to rise regardless of birth. All of this is true, and all of it is incomplete, because it leaves out the bodies. It leaves out the men who were tortured for sport. It leaves out the crews who were murdered after they surrendered. It leaves out the reality that what we are discussing when we discuss Golden Age piracy is not an alternative economic system or a form of social rebellion, but a phenomenon that was, in its essence, about violence, about the power to inflict it and the inability to escape it. Lowe makes this impossible to ignore. His career strips away the romanticism and reveals what lies beneath, the human capacity for cruelty when consequences are removed. This is not a comfortable subject. It raises questions that have no satisfying answers. Where does such cruelty come from? What allows it to flourish? What responsibility do we bear for the systems that produce men like Lowe and give them the means to do what they do? These questions were asked in the 18th century, and they are asked now, and the answers remain elusive. We can point to childhood poverty, to the brutality of maritime labor, to the specific traumas that may or may not have shaped Lowe's psychology. We can construct explanations that feel plausible. But explanations are not justifications, and even the most complete explanation leaves a residue of mystery, a sense that something in human nature exceeds our ability to account for it. The ships that Lowe attacked were not abstractions. They were floating communities, small worlds unto themselves, populated by men who had families and histories and hopes for the future. When Lowe's crew took a prize, they were not seizing cargo from a faceless commercial entity. They were confronting actual human beings who had embarked on a voyage expecting to survive it. The terror those men felt was real terror. The pain they experienced was real pain. The deaths they died were real deaths, each one the ending of a story that would never be completed. The historical record tends to aggregate these experiences into statistics. So many ships taken, so many men killed, but the aggregation is a lie. Each number was a person. Each death was a catastrophe for someone. Lowe understood this. That was part of the point. The cruelty was not incidental to his piracy. It was, in some sense, the purpose of it. He did not torture men to extract information or to secure compliance. He tortured them because he wanted to. The screams were the product, not a byproduct. The suffering was the goal, not a means to some other end. This is what separates him from pirates who were merely ruthless. Ruthlessness has a logic. You kill to eliminate threats, to discourage resistance, to establish a reputation that will make future victims surrender without fighting. The violence serves a strategic purpose. It is calibrated, even when it is extreme. Lowe's violence was not calibrated. It exceeded any strategic necessity. It continued after the point had been made, after resistance was impossible, after the only remaining purpose was the pleasure of infliction. The men who sailed with him saw this. They participated in it, some enthusiastically and some reluctantly, but they all witnessed it. And eventually, for some of them, witnessing became unbearable. The sources disagree on the exact sequence of events that led to Lowe's abandonment by his crew, but they agree on the underlying cause. He had become too much even for pirates. The men who had signed articles agreeing to share in violence and plunder found that Lowe's appetites exceeded what they had agreed to. He had violated something, not a law, obviously, since they were all outlaws, but something like an understanding about what piracy was for. It was for wealth. It was for freedom from the strictures of legitimate society. It was for adventure, perhaps, or revenge, or simply for the absence of alternatives. It was not supposed to be for this. The mutiny, if that is the right word for what happened, was itself a kind of moral statement, not a noble one. These were men who had committed their own share of atrocities, but a statement nonetheless. There were limits. Even in the absence of law, even among criminals, even in the anarchic spaces of the ocean, there were things that could not be tolerated. Lowe had found those limits and crossed them. His own crew, the men who had followed him into battle and shared in his profits and witnessed his cruelties without objection, had finally seen enough. They put him in a boat without provisions, and they sailed away. They left him to the sea, which has no opinion about human behavior and grants no appeals. What happened next is silence. The historical record, which has followed Lowe across the Atlantic and through dozens of attacks, simply stops. He was seen being set adrift. He was not seen again. The various accounts of his ultimate fate are speculation dressed up as certainty, each one inventing an ending that the evidence does not support. Perhaps he was rescued by a French ship and hanged in Martinique. Perhaps he made landfall in Brazil and lived out his days in obscurity. Perhaps he drifted until thirst or starvation or exposure claimed him, his body eventually sliding into the water that had been his kingdom. We do not know. We will not know. The ocean kept its secrets as it has kept so many others, and the man who had made himself unforgettable disappeared into a silence from which no historian can retrieve him. This is, in its way, a fitting ending. Lowe had spent his career demonstrating the fragility of human life, the ease with which it could be extinguished, the indifference of the world to individual suffering. Now he became another demonstration of the same lesson. The sea that had carried him from prize to prize swallowed him without comment. The winds that had filled his sails did not mourn his absence. The vast commercial system that he had disrupted continued to function, absorbing the losses he had caused and moving on to new concerns. He had been a terror, and then he was nothing. And the transition between those states was no different from 1,000 other such transitions that the Atlantic witnessed every year. But the story did not end with his disappearance. Stories never do. They persist in forms their subjects cannot control, taking on meanings that were never intended, serving purposes that were never imagined. Lowe's story became part of a larger narrative about the Golden Age of Piracy, which itself became part of still larger narratives about crime and punishment, about the expansion of state power, about the human capacity for violence, about the meaning of freedom and its limits. Each generation that encountered his story found something different in it. For the 18th century, he was a warning about the dangers of tolerating piracy. For the 19th, he was a curiosity from a wilder age, safely contained in the past. For the 20th and 21st, he became something else again, a case study perhaps in the psychology of cruelty, or a data point in the history of Atlantic commerce, or simply a compelling character in the endless human drama of crime and retribution. The sources that survive him are partial and biased. The trial records were compiled by men who wanted convictions. The newspaper accounts were written by men who wanted to sell papers. The pamphlets were produced by men who wanted to titillate and terrify their readers. Everyone who wrote about Lowe had an agenda, and those agendas shaped what they recorded and what they omitted. The historian approaches this material knowing that truth is somewhere inside it, but that extracting truth requires constant vigilance against the distortions of the sources. We know more than we can prove. We suspect more than we know. We imagine more than we suspect. And somewhere beneath all the layers of knowledge and suspicion and imagination, there was an actual man who actually lived and actually did the things attributed to him, a man whose inner experience is forever inaccessible, whose motivations can only be guessed at, whose humanity is undeniable even when his inhumanity is the subject of discussion. He was born in Westminster. He died somewhere in the Atlantic. Between those 2 points, he lived a life that was remarkable for its violence and its brevity. He rose from poverty to command. He fell from command to solitude. He terrorized an ocean and then vanished into it. These facts are the skeleton of his story. The flesh that we put on those bones is partly historical reconstruction and partly imaginative projection, and the line between the two is never as clear as we would like it to be. What remains, after all the accounts have been read and all the interpretations considered, is an irreducible strangeness. Lowe does not fit the categories that we want to impose on him. He was not a Robin Hood, stealing from the rich to give to the poor. He was not a freedom fighter, rebelling against colonial oppression. He was not a rational actor, maximizing his utility within the constraints of his situation. He was something simpler and more disturbing, a man who liked to hurt people and who found himself in circumstances that allowed him to do so without restraint. The Golden Age of Piracy produced many remarkable figures, but it produced only one Edward Lowe. The others had their cruelties, but their cruelties were instrumental. Lowe's cruelty was the instrument itself. He was not pirating in order to achieve some other goal. He was achieving some other goal in order to pirate, and the goal was the infliction of suffering. The sea has been crossed many times since his day. The routes he sailed are now shipping lanes, traversed by container ships and tankers and cruise liners that dwarf anything the 18th century could imagine. The ports he terrorized have become modern cities, their colonial pasts visible only in architecture and street names. The technology of maritime transport has transformed beyond recognition. GPS and radar and satellite communication have made navigation trivial. Refrigeration and steel hulls and diesel engines have changed what ships can carry and how far they can go. The Atlantic that Lowe knew, wild, ungoverned, full of opportunity for men who lived outside the law, exists now only in historical imagination. But the human constants persist. The capacity for cruelty has not evolved away. The circumstances that allow it to flourish may have changed, but they have not disappeared. Wars and failed states and ungoverned spaces continue to produce men who discover what Lowe discovered, that violence, once started, has a momentum of its own, that each act makes the next one easier, that the inhibitions that restrain most people can be eroded by repetition and impunity until nothing remains but appetite and opportunity. Lowe was not unique in this. He was an extreme case of a general phenomenon. The specific conditions of early 18th century piracy allowed his particular expression of that phenomenon, but the phenomenon itself is older than history and shows no signs of disappearing. The lesson, if there is one, is not comfortable. We like to believe that monsters are aberrations, that they come from nowhere and return to nowhere, that they tell us nothing about ourselves. Lowe's story suggests otherwise. He came from a specific place, shaped by specific conditions, and he became what those conditions made possible. The empire that he disrupted was itself built on violence, on slavery, on conquest, on the systematic extraction of wealth from people who had no power to resist. He was a parasite on a parasitic system. His cruelties were spectacular and individual. The system's cruelties were mundane and structural. The difference in scale does not make them different in kind. This is not an excuse for Lowe. His victims were innocent of the system's crimes. The merchants and sailors he tortured were not personally responsible for the slave trade or the dispossession of indigenous peoples. They were working men trying to make a living in the world as they found it. Their suffering was unjust, and the man who inflicted it was responsible for his actions regardless of the broader context in which those actions occurred. But understanding requires looking at that context. Lowe did not emerge from a vacuum. He was produced by a world, and the world that produced him had its own accounts to settle. The wind still blows across the Atlantic. The currents still flow in their ancient patterns. The ocean that carried Lowe from crime to crime continues its work of separating continents and connecting them, of sustaining commerce and swallowing secrets. Somewhere in its depths, perhaps, lie the remains of his final boat, long since dissolved into the elements that compose the sea itself. The atoms that were once Edward Lowe are now dispersed through the water column, indistinguishable from the atoms of his victims and his crew and the fish that fed on all of them. The sea makes no distinctions. It receives everything and keeps nothing, and the lives that pass through it leave no more trace than ripples on a surface that has never been still. The question of Edward Lowe's end has occupied historians for 3 centuries, and it resists resolution. The sources diverge. The accounts contradict one another. The man who left such vivid traces through his years of active piracy vanishes into a fog of rumor and speculation the moment his crew turned against him. We know with reasonable confidence what precipitated the crisis. It was not an act of cruelty against a prisoner. His men had witnessed too many of those to be shocked. It was not a failure of leadership in battle. Lowe had proven himself capable there, whatever his other deficiencies. It was something more personal, more intimate, more directly threatening to the men who served under him. The incident, as recorded in the fragmentary sources that survive, occurred sometime in early 1724, aboard whatever vessel Lowe commanded at that moment. The records are unclear on this point, as Lowe changed ships with some frequency, capturing and abandoning them as circumstances demanded. A man had disagreed with Lowe. The nature of the disagreement is not specified. It may have been about tactics. It may have been about the distribution of plunder. It may have been about nothing at all, a chance remark that caught Lowe in the wrong mood. What matters is that Lowe killed him. This was not in itself unusual. Pirate captains killed men. The democracy of the pirate ship had its limits, and one of those limits was the captain's authority in moments of crisis. But this killing was different. The man Lowe killed was not a prisoner, not a captured merchant sailor, not an enemy. He was one of Lowe's own crew. He was asleep when Lowe murdered him. The sources are vague on the method. Some accounts say Lowe cut the man's throat. Others say he shot him. The precise means matters less than the circumstances. A sleeping man, a fellow pirate, no provocation immediate enough to justify the act, even by the loose standards of pirate justice. Lowe had crossed a line that even his crew, hardened as they were to his excesses against outsiders, could not accept. The logic of pirate society was transactional. Men followed a captain because he brought them profit. They tolerated his eccentricities, his cruelties, his demands because the alternative was worse: dispersal, capture, hanging. But this tolerance had boundaries. A captain who killed his own crew in their sleep was a captain who might kill anyone. Every man aboard looked at the sleeping quarters differently after that night. Every man wondered if he might be next. The response was swift. The crew held a council, this much the sources agree on, and voted to remove Lowe from command. The mechanism varied in different accounts. Some say they simply put him off the ship, lowering a boat and leaving him to whatever fate the sea provided. Others say they marooned him on a small island, following the traditional punishment for transgressions against the pirate code. Still others suggest a more direct solution, though no account claims that Lowe was killed by his crew. The most detailed version of the story comes from sources written decades later, filtered through multiple retellings and embellished in ways that are difficult to disentangle from the historical core. According to this version, Lowe was set adrift in a small boat with no provisions, left to die of exposure or starvation or thirst. The Atlantic is vast. A man alone in a small boat, without food or water, without navigational instruments, without any means of propulsion beyond whatever sail or oars the boat might carry, such a man's chances of survival were minimal. The ocean that had been Lowe's hunting ground became his grave. But even this is uncertain. Other accounts suggest that Lowe survived his abandonment, that he was picked up by a French vessel, that he was recognized and arrested, and eventually hanged for his crimes. The location of this supposed execution varies. Some sources say Martinique, others say other French Caribbean possessions. No documentary evidence confirms any of these claims. No record of a trial survives. No grave has ever been identified. The mystery is appropriate, perhaps. Lowe had made himself into a figure of terror, a name whispered in ports from Boston to Barbados, a threat invoked to frighten children and sailors alike. Such figures often resist clean endings. The imagination, once engaged by them, does not want to let them go. A simple death, hanging, drowning, fever, seems inadequate to the legend. The stories proliferate, offering alternative fates, suggesting that perhaps Lowe escaped, perhaps he lived on under another name, perhaps he died in some more dramatic fashion that the records failed to capture. The truth is almost certainly simpler and sadder. He was abandoned by men who had finally had enough, and he died alone. And the sea took him as it has taken so many others, and no one recorded the specifics, because by then no one cared. His moment had passed. The Golden Age itself was ending. The naval patrols were tightening their grip on the Caribbean. The pirates were being hunted down, one by one, hanged in public spectacles meant to deter those who might follow their example. Lowe's disappearance was one small part of a larger dissolution. The world was moving on. What he left behind was a reputation. The stories of his cruelties outlived him by centuries. They were told and retold, embellished and exaggerated, passed from one collection to another until they became almost folkloric in character. The man who cut off lips and made men eat them. The man who burned captives alive. The man who tortured and killed with what seemed like genuine pleasure in the act. These images persisted, becoming part of the mythology of piracy, serving as a counterweight to the romanticized versions that would later dominate popular imagination. The romanticization is worth examining. By the 19th century, pirates had become figures of adventure and freedom in popular culture. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, published in 1883, gave the world Long John Silver, a pirate who was villainous, certainly, but also charming, intelligent, even likable in his way. The pirate of romance was a rebel against unjust authority, a free spirit in a world of constraints, a figure of transgressive appeal. This version of piracy had little room for Edward Lowe. The tension between the romantic pirate and the historical reality has never been fully resolved. Popular culture continues to present pirates as lovable rogues, charismatic outlaws, adventurers in fancy dress. The Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, to name only the most successful example, built a multi-billion-dollar entertainment property on this romanticized foundation. Captain Jack Sparrow is a trickster, a charmer, a man whose violence is mostly comic and whose moral failings are presented as endearing quirks. He is not Edward Lowe. The historical pirates were, of course, a diverse group. Some were closer to the romantic image than others. Bartholomew Roberts, as we have seen, brought a certain elegance to his piracy. The fine clothes, the tea drinking, the semi-democratic governance of his crew. Henry Every achieved a kind of legendary status as the man who captured the Mughal treasure ship and retired wealthy. Even Blackbeard, for all his fearsome reputation, seems to have been more theatrical than genuinely sadistic. The smoking fuses in his beard were performance, designed to terrify without necessarily backing up the threat with actual torture. Lowe was different. Lowe reminds us that the pirate world included men who were simply cruel, whose violence served no strategic purpose, whose behavior alienated even their own colleagues. He is the corrective to the romance, the figure who makes it impossible to idealize the profession without confronting what it actually involved. If you are going to celebrate piracy as freedom, you must acknowledge that the freedom in question included the freedom to be Edward Lowe. The implications extend beyond piracy itself. Lowe's career raises questions about the nature of evil and its relationship to circumstance. Was he born a sadist, predisposed by some quirk of neurology to enjoy the suffering of others? Or was he made one, shaped by the deprivations of his childhood, the losses he suffered, the brutalities of the world he inhabited? The question is unanswerable with the evidence available, but it is worth asking. Modern psychology offers various frameworks for understanding people like Lowe. The clinical language of personality disorders, antisocial, narcissistic, sadistic, provides categories into which his behavior might be sorted. Studies of violence and its perpetrators suggest that cruelty of his type often emerges from a combination of factors: early trauma, lack of empathy, exposure to violence as normal, opportunities for impunity. Lowe possessed all of these. He grew up in poverty in a violent world. He lost his wife and child. He entered a profession that not only permitted but rewarded the use of force, and he operated in a space where normal social constraints were suspended, where there was no law, no punishment, no one to stop him. The combination proved explosive. Each element fed the others in a destructive spiral. The early hardship may have limited his capacity for empathy. The loss of his family removed whatever emotional anchor might have restrained him. The pirate life provided endless opportunities to act on whatever impulses remained, and the impunity, the total freedom from consequence, allowed those actions to escalate without check until they reached the extremities recorded in the sources. This does not excuse Lowe. Explanation is not exculpation. Many people suffer similar hardships and do not become torturers. The capacity to choose otherwise exists even in difficult circumstances, and Lowe chose what he chose. But understanding the conditions that produced him helps us understand how such people come to exist, and perhaps how their emergence might be prevented. The prevention, of course, is complicated. You cannot eliminate poverty or grief or violence or the human capacity for cruelty. You can only manage the circumstances that allow these things to combine in particularly destructive ways. The Golden Age of Piracy was precisely such a circumstance, a moment when imperial systems created both the wealth worth stealing and the gaps in enforcement that made stealing possible, when thousands of men with maritime skills and violent dispositions found themselves unemployed after the end of European wars, when the Atlantic became a space where normal rules did not apply. The age ended because those conditions changed. The peace established by the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 eventually gave way to renewed conflict, drawing sailors back into naval service. The colonial powers invested more heavily in patrolling their waters, closing the gaps that pirates had exploited. The economic logic shifted as well, as sugar and tobacco plantations consolidated, as the slave trade became more regularized, as the Caribbean transformed from a frontier into an established colonial system with less tolerance for disruption. The pirates were suppressed not by moral awakening, but by administrative adjustment. They became inconvenient, and so they were eliminated. Lowe vanished into this elimination. He was one of the last of the major pirate captains to operate in the Caribbean, and by the time of his disappearance in 1724, the age was effectively over. A few scattered figures continued for some years after, but the great period of Atlantic piracy, the decade-long spasm of theft and violence that had disrupted imperial commerce from Brazil to Newfoundland, was finished. The world moved on to other concerns. The memory persisted, though. The pirates entered mythology. They became figures of story, characters in novels and plays, and eventually films and television shows. The skulls and crossbones they had flown as signals of terror became decorative motifs, stripped of their original meaning, applied to children's lunchboxes and amusement park rides. The horror was sanitized, the violence domesticated, the whole bloody business transformed into entertainment. Lowe's memory persisted differently. He was too extreme for the mainstream of pirate romance. His cruelties did not fit the swashbuckling narrative. When his name appears in popular accounts, it is usually as a cautionary example, a reminder that not all pirates were lovable rogues, that some of them were simply monsters. He serves as the dark other to the romanticized figures, the evidence that gets cited when someone wants to puncture the fantasy. This role has its own kind of immortality. Lowe is remembered precisely because he was so terrible. His name survives because his actions were memorable, unforgettably, horrifyingly memorable. The men he killed and tortured are mostly anonymous, their names lost to history, their individual lives dissolved into the general category of victims. But the man who victimized them remains vivid, his deeds still capable of shocking audiences 300 years later. There is something troubling about this asymmetry, about the way that extreme violence confers a kind of fame on its perpetrators while leaving the victims in shadow. The asymmetry is not unique to Lowe, of course. History remembers conquerors better than conquered, killers better than killed, the powerful better than the powerless. This is partly a function of the sources. The people who wrote things down were usually the people with power or closely connected to power, and their perspectives shaped the record. but it is also a function of narrative itself, of the way stories work. Evil is more dramatic than goodness. Cruelty is more vivid than kindness. The monster makes a better character than the victim. Lowe was aware of this, perhaps. His theatrical cruelties, the forced lip-eating, the burning of ships with crews aboard, the elaborate torments that went far beyond what was necessary to extract information or compliance, suggest a man who understood the power of spectacle. He was creating stories about himself, stories that would be told in every port where his name was known, stories that would precede him to his next conquest and terrify his next victims before he even arrived. The cruelty was communication as well as satisfaction. It said, "This is what I am, this is what I will do, this is what you should fear." The strategy worked to a point. His reputation was indeed fearsome. Ships did surrender without a fight rather than face what they knew awaited them if they resisted. The stories did spread, carried by the survivors he released and the newspapers that reported on his activities. Lowe achieved exactly the notoriety he seemed to be seeking, but the strategy also contained the seeds of its own failure. A reputation for uncontrolled cruelty is useful against enemies, but it is less useful with allies. His crew eventually concluded that they could not trust a man whose violence had no limits, whose mood could turn murderous at any moment, who had demonstrated that even sleep was no protection against his sudden rages. The abandonment was the logical outcome of the terror he had cultivated. He had made himself into a monster, and monsters are eventually destroyed or cast out. The men who put him off the ship were acting in their way rationally. They were protecting themselves from a threat that had become too immediate to tolerate. The same qualities that made Lowe dangerous to his enemies made him dangerous to his friends. The line between them had always been thin, and eventually it dissolved entirely. We might imagine his final hours. Alone in a small boat, watching his former ship sail away, contemplating a horizon that offered nothing but salt water in every direction. The sun would have risen and set. The waves would have rocked the boat with their endless rhythm. Thirst would have come first, then hunger, then the peculiar clarity that dehydration brings before it brings confusion and death. He would have had time to think, if he was capable of thinking in the way we might imagine. Time to consider his choices, his actions, the path that had led him to this ending. But this is speculation, and speculation of a particularly literary kind, the imposition of meaning on a death that may have had no meaning at all. Lowe may not have been capable of the reflection we might want to attribute to him. He may have spent his final hours raging at the men who betrayed him, or scheming improbable escapes, or simply existing in the animal state of a body that knows it is dying. The sources tell us nothing of his final thoughts, and there's no reason to believe he shared them with anyone. What remains is the trace he left on history, the records of his crimes, the testimonies of his survivors, the impression of a man who embodied something dark and persistent in human nature. He was not the worst person who ever lived. He was not even the worst pirate. His cruelties, however spectacular, were dwarfed in scale by the institutional cruelties of the empires he parasitized. The slave ships that he occasionally attacked and plundered had already inflicted more suffering than he could match in a lifetime of cutting off lips and burning captives. But scale is not the only measure. Lowe's cruelties had a personal quality that the system's cruelties lacked. He looked into the eyes of the men he hurt. He heard their screams. He chose, in each moment, to continue rather than to stop. The slave traders and plantation owners and colonial administrators operated at a distance from the suffering they caused. They wrote ledgers and signed documents and collected profits without necessarily confronting the human reality of what they were doing. Lowe had no such buffer. His violence was intimate, direct, impossible to deny or rationalize or hide behind abstraction. This intimacy is what makes him memorable and what makes him disturbing. He reminds us that cruelty is not only systemic, not only structural, not only the emergent property of evil institutions, it is also personal. It is chosen. It exists in individuals, in moments, in the gap between the hand that holds the knife and the flesh that receives it. Systems matter, but systems are composed of people, and some of those people are Edward Lowe. The question that persists across the centuries is not whether Lo deserved his fate. By any moral calculus available to his contemporaries or to us, he did. The question is what he represents, what his existence tells us about the world that produced him and the waters that received him. He was born into poverty in Westminster, in the shadow of an empire that was building itself on violence it preferred not to name. The London of his childhood was a city of gin and disease and desperate labor, a place where children died young and those who survived learned early that the world was not arranged for their benefit. This is not an excuse. Millions of people endured similar circumstances without becoming what Lo became. But it is context, and context matters. The cruelty he learned to practice was not invented by him. It existed in the world before he entered it, the cat-o'-nine-tails that scarred the backs of sailors, the branding irons that marked the faces of criminals, the gibbets where bodies rotted as warnings to the living. These were the instruments of legitimate authority, the tools of the state that claimed to represent civilization and order. Lo took these instruments and used them for his own purposes. He was, in a sense, a student of the empire he terrorized. He learned its lessons too well. The Golden Age of Piracy was drawing toward its close in the years of Lo's supremacy. The navies were growing stronger. The colonial governments were becoming more coordinated in their responses. The legal and economic pressures that had once made piracy a viable alternative to legitimate seafaring were shifting, tilting the balance toward the powers that controlled the land. Lo would have been aware of this, at least dimly. The pirates who survived in these later years were increasingly desperate, increasingly violent, increasingly willing to take risks that earlier generations would have avoided. The mathematics of the profession were changing. The odds were getting worse. Some pirates responded by seeking pardons and retiring to marginal respectability. Others fled to more remote waters, hoping to extend their careers by a few more years. Lo responded by doubling down on terror. If the odds were against him anyway, there was no reason to moderate his behavior. If capture meant hanging, there was no benefit to showing mercy. The logic of his position pushed him toward extremity, and he went willingly. But we should be careful not to attribute too much rationality to his choices. The historical record suggests that Lo enjoyed what he did. The contemporaries who described his crimes noted not just their severity, but their inventiveness, the evident pleasure he took in devising new forms of torment. This was not the calculated terror of a man pursuing a strategic objective. It was something closer to compulsion, to addiction, to the satisfaction of an appetite that could not be sated. Some men become cruel because circumstances make cruelty useful. Lo became cruel because cruelty felt good to him, and circumstances merely gave him the opportunity to indulge. The 18 months of his recorded career represent, in this sense, a kind of experiment. What happens when a man with this particular darkness is given command of other men, given weapons, given victims, given the freedom that the open ocean provides? The answer is what the sources describe: a trail of mutilated bodies, burned ships, terrorized communities. The experiment demonstrated what should have been obvious, but apparently required demonstration: that restraint is not natural, that cruelty is not automatically punished, that a man can do terrible things for a long time before the consequences catch up with him. The ocean is large. The colonial administration is slow. Justice, such as it is, depends on the improbable convergence of luck and power and geography. Lo evaded that convergence until his own men decided they could no longer afford to sail with him. The crew's decision to abandon him deserves more attention than the sources give it. These were not gentle men. They had participated in Lo's crimes, had held victims while he cut them, had cheered or at least acquiesced while he demonstrated his authority through spectacle and blood. They were complicit in everything he had done, and yet they reached a limit. Something happened, whether a specific incident or the gradual accumulation of recognition, that made them conclude he had to go. The violence they had tolerated, even celebrated, became too much. The same terror that protected them from external enemies began to feel like a threat from within. They looked at the man who led them and saw not a captain, but a danger. not a protector, but a liability. The mutiny, if that is the right word for putting a man adrift, was an act of self-preservation disguised as moral judgment. Or perhaps it was moral judgment disguised as self-preservation. The two are difficult to disentangle when the stakes are survival. What is remarkable is that they did not simply kill him. They had the numbers, they had the weapons. They could have cut his throat while he slept and disposed of the body with no more ceremony than they would have given a dead rat. Instead, they put him in a boat and set him loose. This suggests a residual reluctance, a lingering respect or fear, an unwillingness to take the final step of ending his life directly. Perhaps they hoped the sea would do what they could not bring themselves to do. Perhaps they wanted deniability, the ability to tell themselves and others that they had not murdered their captain, merely cast him out. Perhaps there was some obscure point of honor involved, some code that permitted abandonment but not assassination. The sources do not explain their reasoning, and we are left to speculate about the moral architecture of men who participated in torture and murder, but drew the line at killing their leader in his sleep. The small boat on the empty ocean is an image that recurs in maritime history. It is the punishment reserved for the worst offenders, the men whose crimes exceed the tolerance of their own kind. To be marooned is to be consigned to a death that is slow and certain, a death that allows time for contemplation but offers no possibility of escape. The victim is not killed, but rather placed in a situation where death is inevitable, where nature completes what men began. There is something particularly cruel about this cruelty. The extension of suffering, the transformation of the entire ocean into a prison without walls. Lowe, who had inflicted so many forms of suffering on so many victims, was now experiencing the slow variety, the kind that unfolds over days rather than hours, that offers hope in the morning and despair by afternoon, that oscillates between determination and surrender until the body simply gives out. We do not know how long he lasted. The calculations are grim but straightforward. A healthy man in a small boat without water under the Caribbean sun might survive 3 or 4 days. With water but no food, perhaps 2 weeks, though the latter days would be characterized by increasing weakness and confusion. Lowe was presumably healthy when they set him adrift. Pirate captains did not generally suffer from malnutrition, but health offers limited protection against the fundamental reality of dehydration. His body would have consumed itself in the manner that bodies do, breaking down muscle tissue, concentrating toxins, losing the capacity for coherent thought. The end, when it came, would have been neither dramatic nor peaceful, simply the cessation of biological function in a body that had exhausted its reserves, unless, of course, it did not happen that way at all. The alternative theory, the one that places Lowe in Brazil and offers him a death by execution rather than exposure, presents a different kind of ending. In this version, he was not abandoned at sea, but rather put ashore, or made his way ashore, or was captured by a passing vessel that delivered him to colonial authority. The details are murky because the sources are contradictory, because the records that might confirm or deny the story have not survived or have never been found. Brazil in the 1720s was a Portuguese colony with its own maritime concerns, its own legal apparatus, its own reasons to execute a pirate who fell into its hands. If Lowe reached Brazil, by design or accident or the charity of sailors who took him off his drifting boat, he would have found a jurisdiction with no interest in showing mercy. The Portuguese were as vigorous in their prosecution of piracy as the English or Spanish, and a man with Lowe's reputation would have been a prize worth displaying. A public execution would have served the colonial government's purposes, would have demonstrated their control over the waters they claimed, would have provided entertainment and instruction to the population they governed. But this alternative, even if true, does not fundamentally change the story. Whether Lowe died of thirst in a small boat or of judicial violence in a Brazilian prison, he died alone and far from home, rejected by the men who had once followed him, subject to forces he could no longer control. The manner of death matters less than its meaning, and the meaning is the same in either version, that the violence he practiced eventually consumed him, that the terror he cultivated made him intolerable, even to men who had committed terrible acts themselves, that the line between weapon and liability was crossed somewhere in those final months, and that once crossed, there was no way back. The absence of a body, of a grave, of a documented end, has allowed Low to persist in legend in ways that more definitively dead pirates have not. There is always the possibility, however remote, that he survived, that he made his way to some shore and lived out his days under an assumed name, that the monster was never actually destroyed, but merely disappeared. This possibility is almost certainly false. The odds against survival were too long, the circumstances too hostile, but it cannot be entirely ruled out, and that uncertainty has given Low a kind of immortality. He exists in the space between history and myth, in the gap where documentation fails and imagination enters. The man who terrified the Atlantic for 18 months continues to haunt it in memory, continues to represent something that the historical record can contain but not quite explain. What he represents is, in the end, a question we have to answer for ourselves. The sources give us the facts, or at least the facts as they were recorded by people with their own interests and limitations, but they do not give us interpretation. They tell us what Low did, but not what it means. That work is left to us, to the people who come after, who read the depositions and the newspaper accounts and the scattered fragments of testimony, and try to make sense of a life that seems designed to resist sense-making. One interpretation is that Low was simply evil, that some men are born with a darkness in them that cannot be explained by circumstance or context, that they emerge from the womb with an appetite for cruelty that will find expression regardless of their environment. This is the interpretation that asks the fewest questions and provides the simplest answers. Low was a monster. Monsters exist. The task of society is to identify them and destroy them before they can do too much damage. There is comfort in this interpretation because it locates the problem in the individual rather than the system, because it suggests that cruelty is a deviation rather than a possibility inherent in all of us. Another interpretation is that Low was made, not born, that the poverty of his childhood, the violence of his early seafaring experience, the brutality of the world he inhabited all combined to produce the man he became. In this version, Low is a symptom rather than a cause, an expression of forces larger than himself that merely happened to concentrate in his particular body and brain. The empire that hanged pirates also produced them. The system of exploitation and extraction that defined colonial commerce also defined the response to it. Low was what the Atlantic world made him, and if we want to understand him, we need to understand the world that taught him violence and then punished him for learning the lesson too well. A third interpretation refuses the binary entirely, insists that Low was both born and made, that nature and nurture are not opposing forces but collaborating ones, that some people are more susceptible to the lessons of violence than others, and that Low happened to be someone for whom the lessons took particularly deep root. This interpretation is less satisfying because it is less clean, because it does not allow us to point at a single cause and say that is what went wrong. That is what we need to fix. But it may be closer to the truth, if truth is what we are after. Human beings are complicated. The combination of temperament and circumstance that produces a Low is not easily replicated, but it is not unique either. There have been other Lows before and since, men and women whose capacity for cruelty exceeded the ordinary and whose circumstances gave them the opportunity to express it. They are rare but not singular. They are data points in a distribution, not violations of its shape. The Golden Age of Piracy produced many such figures, though Low remains among the most extreme. The conditions of the era, the weakness of state control over the ocean, the prevalence of violence in ordinary maritime life, the profits available to men willing to take what they wanted, created a kind of laboratory for human behavior at its edges. Most pirates were not particularly cruel. They were laborers who had chosen illegal work over legal work, rational actors pursuing wealth through unconventional means. But among them were men like Low, men whose relationship to violence was not instrumental but intrinsic, not a means to an end but an end in itself. The era gave these men a stage, and they performed on it with enthusiasm. The stage is gone now. The conditions that made Golden Age piracy possible have not existed for 3 centuries. The oceans are surveilled, patrolled, mapped in ways that Lowe could not have imagined. The small boats that once carried pirates to their prizes would be detected and intercepted before they could reach their targets. The legal and economic structures that pushed men toward piracy have been replaced by different structures that push men toward different forms of illegality. The lessons of Edward Lowe are not directly applicable to the present moment. We are not in danger of producing another Lowe in quite the same way, not likely to see his particular form of cruelty replicated on the same stage where he performed it. And yet, he persists. He persists in the historical record, in the newspaper accounts and trial transcripts and victims' testimonies that have survived the centuries. He persists in the popular imagination, in the Halloween costumes and theme park rides and adventure films that draw on the iconography of piracy without fully confronting its reality. He persists in the questions he raises, the uncomfortable recognitions he forces on anyone willing to look at him directly. He reminds us that cruelty is not always punished, that monsters are not always destroyed, that the ocean is large and indifferent and keeps few secrets except by accident. He reminds us that the line between civilization and barbarism is thinner than we might prefer to believe, that the same species capable of cathedrals and symphonies is also capable of cutting off a man's lips and forcing him to eat them. This is not a comfortable reminder. It is not supposed to be. The trace he left on history is composed of victims' voices, recorded imperfectly by colonial officials more interested in prosecution than preservation. We know their injuries better than their names. We know what was done to them better than who they were before it was done. They survive in the record only as evidence of Lowe's cruelty, their entire lives reduced to the moment of their encounter with him. This is its own kind of violence, a second violation layered on top of the first. The man who tortured them is remembered. They are largely forgotten. The narrative gravitates toward the perpetrator because perpetrators make better stories, because their choices drive the action, because victims are acted upon rather than acting. This is a problem that the historical method creates but cannot solve. We tell stories about people who did things, and Lowe did a great deal. His victims, for the most part, had things done to them, and their stories are harder to recover, harder to tell, harder to make compelling to audiences that have been trained to seek agency and action in their protagonists. But they existed. They were real. The Portuguese sailors whose lips he cut, the captain whose ears he removed, the cook he burned alive, the countless unnamed others who crossed his path and suffered for it. They had lives before they met him, and some of them had lives after. They returned to ports, carried their scars, told their stories to anyone who would listen. Some of their testimonies made it into the official records. Most did not. They are the dark matter of this narrative, present but invisible, shaping the story we can see without themselves being seen. Any honest account of Edward Lowe must acknowledge that the documentation that preserves him also erases them, that we know the monster better than his prey, that the archive is not neutral, but selective, in ways that serve some memories and discard others. And so, we come to the end, or rather to the place where the trail goes cold, where the sources fail, where the ocean that gave Lowe his stage finally takes him back and refuses to tell us how. The last confirmed sighting of Edward Lowe, at the height of his power, comes in the summer of 1724. He is somewhere in the Atlantic, still commanding, still hunting, still inflicting the particular forms of cruelty that have become his signature. His fleet has shrunk from its peak, but remains formidable. His crew, those who have not been captured or killed or simply slipped away at some convenient port, still follow him. The terror he inspires in merchant captains remains potent enough to guarantee surrender without combat in most encounters. He is, by any reasonable measure, still among the most dangerous men on the Atlantic seaboard. And then he vanishes. The disappearance is not dramatic. There is no final battle, no last stand, no climactic confrontation with a naval squadron sent specifically to destroy him. The newspapers that have followed his career with horrified fascination simply stop receiving reports. The colonial governors who have offered rewards for his capture stop issuing proclamations. The merchant captains who have dreaded his approach stop encountering him. Edward Lowe, who had been everywhere, is suddenly nowhere. What happened? The honest answer is that we do not know. The sources that have carried us this far abandon us at the threshold of his ending. We have speculation, rumor, second-hand reports of doubtful reliability. We have stories that may be true, may be embellished, may be entirely invented. We do not have certainty. The most persistent account, the one that appears most frequently in the later compilations in pirate histories, holds that Lowe's own crew finally turned against him. That the men who had followed him through years of successful piracy, who had participated in or witnessed his escalating brutalities, who had enriched themselves on the prizes he took and the terror he generated, eventually decided that he had gone too far. The specific trigger, according to this version, was the murder of a sleeping crewman. Lowe, in one of his rages, killed a man who was not awake to defend himself, not guilty of any offense, not even conscious of the danger approaching him. And this, somehow, crossed a line that all the previous cruelties had not crossed. The logic is strange, but not inexplicable. Pirates operated under codes, customs, expectations that governed the distribution of violence within their communities. A captain could be brutal to prisoners, could torture captives, could execute those who resisted, and still maintain his standing among his men. But to turn that violence inward, to kill one of your own without cause or provocation, violated the compact that held pirate crews together. It suggested that no one was safe, that the captain's rage was genuinely ungovernable, that loyalty offered no protection against becoming the next victim. The men who had watched Lowe burn Portuguese sailors alive apparently drew the line at watching him murder them in their hammocks. According to this version, they put him in a small boat without provisions, without navigation tools, without weapons, and set him adrift somewhere in the Atlantic. A death sentence delivered slowly, by thirst and exposure and starvation, rather than quickly by blade or bullet. A punishment that matched the cruelty Lowe had shown to others, that forced him to experience over days the helplessness his victims had felt in their final hours. The ocean that had been his hunting ground became his prison, his executioner, his grave. It is a satisfying story. It offers justice of a kind, poetic justice, the torturer tortured by his own element. It suggests that there are limits even among the limitless, that cruelty pushed far enough eventually consumes itself. It allows us to believe that the universe bends, however slowly, toward something like moral order. Whether it is true is another matter. The account appears first in sources written decades after the events they describe, compiled by authors who had access to rumor and legend, but not to eyewitnesses. The details shift between versions. The sleeping crewman is sometimes a quartermaster, sometimes a common sailor, sometimes a figure of no particular rank. The location of the mutiny is sometimes specified, sometimes left vague. The number of men who participated, the manner of their decision, the words spoken before they put him over the side. All of these remain unrecorded, unknowable, available only to imagination. Other accounts offer different endings. Some hold that Lowe made it to Brazil, that he abandoned piracy and disappeared into the vast interior of South America, that he lived out his remaining years under an assumed name in some colonial backwater where English justice could not reach him. This version appeals to a different narrative instinct, the one that wants monsters to escape, to remain at large, to remind us that the world is not always safe. It offers no closure, no justice, only the unsettling possibility that Lowe died old, comfortable, unpunished. Still, other accounts suggest that he was captured by the French and hanged on the island of Martinique, his career ending not in the open ocean, but in a colonial courtyard, his body displayed as a warning to others who might consider following his path. This version provides official justice, state-sanctioned execution, the formal machinery of law finally catching up with a man who had evaded it for years. But the documentation for this ending is thin, contested, difficult to verify against the primary sources that survive. The truth is that we do not know how Edward Lowe died. We know that he stopped appearing in the records sometime in 1724. We know that no reliable account of his capture, execution, or natural death has survived. We know that the ocean kept whatever secret his ending contained. This uncertainty is itself significant. Lowe was one of the most notorious pirates of his era, a man whose cruelties were reported in newspapers throughout the Atlantic world, a figure of genuine public fascination and horror. If he had been captured and tried and hanged by English authorities, the event would have been documented, celebrated, used as propaganda against piracy and evidence of imperial justice. If he had died in battle against a naval squadron, the commander who destroyed him would have claimed the credit, written the reports, collected whatever reward was on offer. The silence of the records suggests that neither of these things happened. It suggests that whatever ended Lowe happened quietly, away from official eyes, in waters where no colonial clerk was present to record it. The marooning story, for all its uncertainties, fits this silence. A crew that mutinied against its captain had every reason to keep the event quiet. They were still pirates, still wanted men, still vulnerable to capture and execution themselves. Reporting that they had disposed of Lowe would have drawn attention to their own identities, their own crimes, their own continuing presence on the ocean. Better to scatter, to disappear into new crews or new identities, to let Lowe's fate remain a mystery that could never be traced back to them. And so the most famous sadist of the Golden Age ends not with a bang, but with a question mark. Not with a dramatic final scene, but with the gradual fading of reports, the slow realization that no one has seen him for months, for years, for decades. He does not die so much as he simply stops appearing. The narrative that has followed him across the Atlantic finally loses his trail somewhere in the empty waters between continents, and the ocean that was his element reclaims him without leaving a receipt. This is perhaps the most appropriate ending for a man like Lowe. He was never fully knowable, never fully explicable, never reducible to the categories we use to make sense of human behavior. The sources that document his cruelties never explain them, never give us access to whatever internal logic or absence of logic drove him to burn men alive, to mutilate the helpless, to find pleasure or purpose in the suffering of others. He remains, even at the end of our investigation, a kind of void at the center of his own story. We know what he did. We do not know why he did it. We do not know what he thought, what he felt, whether he experienced anything resembling guilt or regret or satisfaction. The interiority that we assume exists in every human being, the stream of consciousness, the moral reasoning, the emotional responses, remains entirely hidden from us. And now his death hides in the same way. The sources that could not explain his cruelty cannot explain his ending. He disappears into the same opacity that surrounded him throughout his career. The ocean that witnessed his atrocities witnessed his final moments as well, and the ocean does not talk. We are left with the trace he carved into the historical record, the trial transcripts and newspaper accounts and victims' testimonies that have survived the centuries. The stories told about him, accurate and inaccurate, that shaped how later generations understood what piracy was and what it could become. The questions he raises about human nature, about the origins of cruelty, about the capacity for violence that exists in our species, alongside the capacity for kindness and creation. Lowe forces us to confront possibilities we would prefer to ignore. The possibility that some people are simply evil, that cruelty can exist without cause, that the universe produces monsters as readily as it produces saints. The possibility that the same social conditions that produce ordinary criminals can also produce extraordinary sadists, that there is no bright line between the desperate man who steals to survive and the desperate man who tortures because he enjoys it. The possibility that civilization's constraints are thinner than we believe, that the right combination of circumstances can strip them away and reveal something underneath that we would rather not see. He also forces us to confront the limits of our own understanding. We tell ourselves that behavior can be explained, that motives can be reconstructed, that if we just dig deep enough into a person's history, we will find the experiences that made them who they became. Lowe defeats this assumption. His biography offers no obvious origin for his cruelty, no trauma that clearly accounts for his later actions, no moment of transformation where an ordinary man became a monster. He seems to have been cruel from the beginning, or at least from the beginning we can document. The violence was not a response to something. It was simply there, waiting for an opportunity to express itself. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It suggests that some people are simply broken in ways that cannot be fixed or even fully understood. It suggests that the human capacity for cruelty is not always produced by circumstances, but sometimes simply exists, a feature of our species that manifests in some individuals more than others. It suggests that the hopeful narratives we tell about rehabilitation and redemption and the essential goodness of human nature do not apply to everyone. Some people, perhaps, are beyond explanation. Some monsters are simply monstrous. But even as we reach this conclusion, we must hold it lightly. We do not actually know Edward Lowe. We know only the partial, biased, incomplete record that survived his passage through the world. We know what colonial officials wrote down, what newspaper editors chose to print, what victims were able to report before the details faded from memory. We do not know what was omitted, what was embellished, what was simply invented to satisfy audiences hungry for horror. The Lowe who appears in the historical record may be more or less cruel than the Lowe who actually existed. The stories told about him may include fictions that have hardened into facts through centuries of repetition. The monster we have constructed from these materials may be accurate, or may be an exaggeration, or may be something in between. This uncertainty does not excuse him. Even if half the atrocities attributed to him were invented, the half that remain would be enough to condemn him beyond any possibility of rehabilitation. Even if the accounts are exaggerated, the core of cruelty they describe is consistent enough, repeated enough, documented in enough independent sources that we can be confident it reflects something real. Lowe tortured people. Lowe killed people in ways designed to maximize their suffering. Lowe found pleasure or purpose in the pain of others. These things are as close to certain as historical knowledge allows, but the uncertainty reminds us that the past is not fully recoverable, that the people who lived in it remain ultimately unknowable, that our narratives about them are constructions built from fragments and inferences and assumptions. We tell stories about Edward Lowe because we need to make sense of people like him, because our minds demand explanations even when explanations are not available, because the alternative, acknowledging that some events simply happened without meaning or purpose, is too difficult to sustain. The story we have told is true, as far as we can know. It is also incomplete, as all historical narratives must be. The Lowe, who burned Portuguese sailors alive on the deck of his ship, was a real person who really did that thing. The Lowe, who cut off a captain's lips and made him eat them, was a real person who really did that thing. But the Lowe who exists in our minds, the character who has moved through this narrative for the past hours, is a construction. We have assembled him from sources and arranged him according to conventions of storytelling that belong to our era, not his. We have made him make sense in ways that perhaps he did not make sense even to himself. The Caribbean in the years after Lowe's disappearance continued as the Caribbean had always continued. Ships sailed, trade flowed. Piracy persisted for a few more years before the Royal Navy and colonial authorities finally suppressed it beyond recovery. The Golden Age that had begun in the wreckage of the War of Spanish Succession ended in the hangings and pardons and naval actions of the 1720s. The men who had sailed under black flags scattered, some executed, some pardoned, some simply vanishing into new lives under new names. The era that had made Lowe possible closed, and the Atlantic world reorganized itself around different structures, different opportunities, different forms of violence. Lowe's name persisted in the records, but faded from active memory. He never achieved the lasting fame of Blackbeard, never became the subject of novels and films and theme park attractions in quite the same way. His cruelties were too extreme, perhaps too difficult to romanticize, too resistant to the softening that makes pirates into adventure story heroes. He remained in the archives, available to anyone who looked, But most people did not look. The Golden Age became a backdrop for swashbuckling fantasy, and Lowe did not fit the fantasy. He was too real, too ugly, too obviously evil to serve as entertainment, and perhaps that is appropriate as well. Perhaps some figures should not be romanticized, should not be made into Halloween costumes and roller coaster themes, should remain in the shadows where they lived. Lowe was not an adventure. Lowe was a man who tortured other men for reasons that remain opaque to us. To make him fun would be to betray the people he hurt, to convert their suffering into spectacle, to continue the erasure that the historical record already performs. We have spent these hours with him not because he deserves attention, but because what he reveals deserves attention. The conditions that produced him, the structures that enabled him, the victims who suffered him, the questions he raises about human nature and historical memory. These are worth examining, even when the central figure is not worth celebrating. Lowe is a lens, not a hero. We look at him to see something else, something about ourselves and our species, and the capacity for cruelty that lurks in our shared inheritance. The ocean where he sailed is still there. It has changed in the 3 centuries since he crossed it, warmer now, more acidic, carrying different ships toward different purposes. But it is recognizably the same body of water that Lowe knew, the same Atlantic that connected Europe and Africa and the Americas, the same vast and indifferent expanse that swallowed his victims' screams and kept no record of their passing. The ocean does not remember Lowe. The ocean does not remember anyone. It simply continues, wave after wave, tide after tide, the same motions it has performed since before humans existed and will continue to perform long after we are gone. Somewhere in that ocean, perhaps, the bones of Edward Lowe rest on the seafloor, or perhaps he made it to Brazil and died on land, or hanged in Martinique and was buried in an unmarked grave, or simply disappeared in a way that left no trace at all. We do not know. The ocean keeps its secrets, and this is one of them. What remains is the record, the newspaper accounts that reported his cruelties to horrified readers throughout the colonies, the trial transcripts that preserved his victims' testimonies for audiences that would never meet them, the historical compilations that gathered the scattered stories into narratives that have survived to the present day. These fragments are what we have. They are not complete, not unbiased, not sufficient to fully reconstruct the man or his era, but they are something. They are a trace, a mark, evidence that certain things happened and certain people suffered and certain questions remain unanswered. Lowe tortured men. Lowe killed men. Lowe carved a path of cruelty across the Atlantic that left scars in the historical record 3 centuries after the wounds healed or the victims died. He was real. His victims were real. The suffering he caused was real. And now he is gone, as everyone eventually is gone, as the ocean eventually takes everything that ventures onto it, as time erases everything that time produces. The Portuguese sailors whose lips he cut are gone too, the captain whose ears he removed, the cook he burned alive. They are not remembered, most of them, not preserved in the archives that preserved their tormentor. They existed, and then they suffered, and then they died or continued to live with their scars, and then eventually they died regardless, and now they are particles of the past that we cannot fully recover. This is the true horror of Edward Lowe. Not just what he did, but what his doing reveals about the structures of memory and narrative that determine who survives and who disappears. He is remembered because he was monstrous. They are forgotten because they were victims. The same historical forces that preserved his name erased theirs. And we who come after, who sift through the archives looking for meaning, perpetuate this pattern even as we try to resist it. We tell stories about the man who did things, not the people to whom things were done. We cannot help it. It is how stories work. But perhaps in acknowledging this, we do something small to correct it. Perhaps in naming the erasure, we make it slightly less complete. Perhaps in saying that the victims mattered, that their suffering was real, that their absence from the record is a second violence layered on top of the first. We create a small space where they can exist, if only as absence, if only as acknowledgement, if only as a reminder that the monster was not the only person in the story. The morning is 3 centuries gone now. The blood has long since washed from the decks of the ships he captured. The screams have faded into the white noise of history, indistinguishable from all the other screams that no one recorded. The Caribbean is a different place, governed by different rules, populated by people who have never heard his name and never will. Low is a footnote, a curiosity, a figure that specialists remember and general audiences forget. But somewhere, in an archive, in a library, in a digital repository that has preserved documents the original clerks never imagined would outlast them, the record remains. The trial transcripts, the newspaper accounts, the victim testimonies, they are still there, still available, still capable of speaking to anyone willing to listen. And the ocean remains too. It was there before him, and it is there after him, and it will be there when everyone who reads these words has joined him in whatever oblivion awaits. The waves continue. The tides obey their ancient rhythms. The water that once carried his ship now carries other ships, container vessels and cruise liners and naval frigates that would have been magic to him, technologies that would have seemed like the work of sorcerers. He sailed west once from Boston Harbor with a small crew and a vessel meant for legitimate trade. He turned pirate in the waters of the Caribbean, and he learned that violence came easily to him, more easily than to most. He tortured and killed and burned and mutilated, and no one stopped him, and the ocean did not care. And then he was gone, marooned perhaps by men who had finally seen enough, or escaped to Brazil, or hanged in Martinique, or taken by disease or storm or simple mischance. Gone, in any case, removed from the world of the living, reduced to documents and memories, and then to documents alone. The waves still move across the Atlantic. The wind still drives them. The ocean that held him does not hold him anymore, or holds him in a way we cannot perceive, dissolved into salt and current and the vast indifferent churn that makes no distinction between the bones of monsters and the bones of their victims. It was always indifferent. That was the thing he understood, perhaps, the thing that made him possible. The ocean does not punish and does not reward. It simply is. And the men who sailed on it could be anything they chose, could become anything circumstances allowed, could discover within themselves capacities they might never have found on land. He discovered cruelty. Others discovered courage or greed or simple endurance. The ocean made space for all of them, reflected none of them back, kept no permanent record of what they did on its surface. The documents that preserve Low were written on land, by men sitting at desks in colonial offices, transcribing testimonies from witnesses who had returned to tell what they had seen. The ocean itself has nothing to say, and so we leave him there, wherever there is. In the unmarked waters of his ending, in the silence of the archives, in the questions that will never be answered. Edward Low, who was born in Westminster and died somewhere in the Atlantic, who hurt more people than we can count, and left wounds that outlasted his own brief existence. The Caribbean is quiet now. The age that made him is over. The ocean continues. It always does.